a few seconds, you will hear the rain sound. It's hard when your thoughts feel like a storm you can't escape. Just look at the road, listen to my voice, and breathe. Right on the white shoulder line, my dash cam just illuminated a single abandoned sneaker soaking in the mud. It's a chilling sight, an eerie marker of a story left unfinished. Instantly, a soul filled the empty passenger space beside me, whispering its final moments and giving me goosebumps. But you are safe here in the dark with me, as I am hearing this rain while driving. No worries. When the story starts, it will all calm down naturally and make the atmosphere soothing so you can relax for the rest of the night. The high-speed modern world strains our nervous systems, but when time stresses, stories heal. I'm Deb, and this is True Horror Stories Film. Before we begin, if these videos help you drift off, it would mean a lot if you left a like or subscribed, or just wrote something small in the comments. Even a single word. It helps other tired people find their way here too. Now let us begin. Hey, come sit with me for a while. Whatever today cost you, you can put it down now, right here. For as long as you need, you have done enough. All I am asking of you tonight is that you let yourself be carried somewhere that is not your own life for a little while. This one moves slowly, and it never fully resolves, and I think that unresolved feeling is the most honest thing I can offer you about the night I am going to describe. 12 years before it happened to me, I told a room full of frightened colleagues that what they were feeling was not real. I was wrong, and a woman I loved like family has not had full use of her hands since. I have spent every year since trying to decide whether being right the second time made up for anything at all. Good evening. I am a charge nurse in a mid-sized regional emergency department in the high desert outside Reno, Nevada. A job I have held long enough to have trained a good portion of the staff currently working alongside me. The overnight shift has its own particular character, different from the controlled chaos of a weekend afternoon, quieter in the gaps between emergencies, but somehow heavier in those same quiet stretches. The kind of hours where a person's mind has more room to wander toward things it would rather not examine too closely. I have spent the better part of 2 decades learning to read that overnight quiet, to know which kind of stillness means a slow night, and which kind means something is about to break it. I want to tell you about a mistake. Before I tell you about a night I still cannot explain, because the mistake is the reason that night nearly broke me in a way the actual danger never could have on its own. 12 years ago, early in my career, I was working a shift when a patient came in following an industrial accident, solvent exposure from a workplace spill, disoriented, breathing poorly, smelling faintly of something none of us could immediately place. I remember the specific texture of that night. A Friday close to midnight, the department already stretched thin with a car accident and 2 cardiac cases ahead of her, everyone moving fast and a little frayed at the edges the way emergency departments always are on their busiest nights. Within 20 minutes, 3 of my colleagues treating her had begun to feel unwell themselves, a nurse named Denise among them, complaining of dizziness and a strange tingling that spread from her hands up through her forearms. Denise had trained me in a very real sense. She had been the senior nurse on my very first shift in that department. The one who taught me how to start an IV on a moving target and how to keep my voice steady when a room was falling apart around me. And some of the confidence I carried into that moment, the confidence that let me speak with such total certainty in front of a frightened room, was confidence she herself had built in me. I was the most senior person on the floor at that particular moment, with my supervisor pulled away to another emergency. And I made a call I have spent every year since trying to live with. I told the room, calmly and with total professional confidence, that what we were seeing was almost certainly anxiety spreading through the department the way it always can in high-stress moments. Fear feeding on itself among people already exhausted by a long shift, and that the correct response was to stay calm and continue working, rather than escalate into an unnecessary evacuation. I was wrong. The patient's clothing, it turned out, was still saturated with an industrial solvent none of us had properly identified or contained, and my insistence on calm delayed a hazmat response by nearly 40 minutes. I remember Denise's face during those 40 minutes. The specific, controlled way she kept working despite the tingling spreading further up her arms, trusting my assessment even as her own body was quietly telling her something different. Because I was the senior nurse in the room, and she had spent years teaching people like me that trusting the senior nurse in the room was how this work stayed safe. Denise never fully regained normal sensation in her hands. She left nursing within the year, and though she has never once blamed me directly, not in 12 years, I have never once stopped blaming myself. I built the rest of my career, deliberately and completely, around never making that particular mistake again. I became the nurse other staff call when something feels wrong, and they need someone senior who will actually listen rather than reflexively reassure. I trained myself, methodically, to take every reported symptom seriously, to escalate rather than dismiss, to treat my own instinct toward calm as something to be doubted rather than trusted. I kept a small, private ritual for years afterward, calling Denise every year on the anniversary of that shift. Not to apologize again, since I had already done that more times than either of us could stand, but simply to hear her voice, to be reminded that the cost of my certainty had a name and a face, rather than remaining an abstract lesson I could file neatly away. I want to tell you about the night that discipline was tested in a direction I never once anticipated. This past winter, close to 3 in the morning, a woman was brought into our emergency department by ambulance in advanced organ failure. Barely conscious, her breathing shallow and irregular in a way that told every one of us, before her chart even reached triage, that she was not going to survive the night. The department was quiet in the particular held breath way it gets in the deepest hours of an overnight shift. Only a handful of patients in beds. Most of the overhead lights dimmed to their nighttime setting. The kind of quiet that makes any sudden arrival feel louder and more consequential than it might at a busier hour. I will not describe her in detail, because I do not believe her suffering is mine to turn into spectacle. And I want you to understand that everything that happened afterward happened to a dying woman who deserved better than to become the center of anyone's strange story. As the team began working to stabilize her, one of our younger nurses, drawing blood from her arm, mentioned an unusual chemical smell coming from the sample, sharp and unfamiliar, unlike anything she recognized from any medication we had administered. I remember glancing over from the next bed, noting the comment the way you note a dozen small, passing observations during any given shift, filing it away without yet understanding that I would spend the rest of that night trying to make sense of it. Within minutes, that same nurse had gone pale and unsteady on her feet, and by the time I reached her side, she was breathing rapidly, complaining of a tingling sensation spreading up through her fingers, a sensation with a name and a shape I recognized instantly and completely, because I had heard almost the exact same words from Denise 12 years earlier. I remember the specific physical jolt of hearing that phrase again, tingling up through her fingers, a sentence I had not heard spoken aloud in over a decade, and had somehow still kept perfectly preserved, word for word, in some cold, waiting corner of my memory. I felt something move through me in that moment that I still do not have a clean name for. A cold, immediate certainty that overrode every other thought in my head at once, my mouth going dry, my own pulse suddenly loud enough in my ears that I had to consciously strain to hear the monitors around me. I did not hesitate. I called for an immediate evacuation of the treatment bay, initiated our hazmat protocol without waiting for confirmation, and pulled every staff member back from that patient's bedside with a speed and force that surprised even me. My body moving through the correct emergency sequence before my mind had finished consciously choosing it, my hands already reaching for the intercom, before I had fully registered deciding to use it. Over the following 20 minutes, 4 more staff members reported symptoms: dizziness, nausea, 1 brief loss of consciousness near the doorway, a pattern unfolding with a speed and a specific shape that felt to every one of us standing in that hallway in full protective gear, undeniably real. I remember the sound of it more than anything else. The overlapping voices calling out symptoms and vitals. The particular hiss of respirator masks being fitted in a hurry. A young tech somewhere behind me quietly crying while she waited her turn to be checked over. And beneath all of it, the steady, insistent beeping of the dying patient's own monitors continuing on exactly as before, indifferent to everything unfolding around her. I remember standing at the nurse's station with my own hand shaking, not from any symptom of my own, but from the sheer, cold effort of holding the department together while it happened. And I remember reaching, in the middle of that chaos, for an entirely unrelated worry, whether I had properly charted the medication order I had given 20 minutes earlier, my mind grasping for something small and solvable to hold, instead of the larger, formless dread building around me. Someone pressed a lukewarm cup of vending machine coffee into my hand at some point during those 20 minutes, and I held it without drinking from it, watching it go fully cold in my grip while I directed traffic through a crisis I still, months later, cannot fully name. The hazmat team found nothing, no trace of any toxic substance in the room, the equipment, the ventilation system, the patient's own clothing or belongings. I watched them work through that room in their heavy suits for the better part of 2 hours, methodical and thorough, in a way that should have been reassuring, and instead only deepened the strange, suspended feeling that had settled over the whole department, the sense of an answer being searched for, in a place it had apparently already decided not to be found. The patient died a short while later, her actual cause of death entirely explainable by the organ failure that had brought her in, unrelated to any toxin anyone could locate. The 5 staff members who had fallen ill recovered fully within hours, their symptoms resolving almost as quickly and inexplicably as they had appeared, leaving behind no lasting injury, no clear diagnosis, nothing our own hospital's investigation was ever able to conclusively explain. I sat with the younger nurse, the one who had first noticed the smell, in the break room near dawn, both of us still in scrubs, neither of us quite ready to go home. She asked me, quietly, whether I thought she had imagined it, and I did not have an honest answer to give her that would have actually helped. Only the same unsettled not knowing I have been carrying ever since. I told her what I believed to be true, that whatever she had felt was real to her, that her body had not lied to her, even if science could never fully explain what it had responded to. And I watched her accept that answer, the way I once needed Denise to accept an answer I gave her, that turned out, disastrously, to be wrong. I do not know, even now, whether what happened in that room was a real, unidentified chemical exposure that simply left no physical trace, or whether it was something closer to what I once wrongly assumed about Denise 12 years earlier, a genuine physiological response to fear itself, spreading person to person through a room already primed by exhaustion and stress to interpret uncertainty as danger. I have read every theory offered by people far more qualified than I am to explain it. Toxicologists, occupational health specialists, a psychologist the hospital brought in afterward to speak with the affected staff, and none of them have ever fully closed the question for me. I called Denise the week after it happened, the way I always do on our anniversary calls, though this one fell outside our usual schedule, and I told her everything, waiting for her to tell me I had finally done it right. She only told me that she was glad no one had been permanently hurt, and that some questions in this work simply do not come with the kind of answer either of us had spent years wanting. What I know is this: if I had responded that night the way I once responded to Denise, calmly, dismissively, certain that panic alone explained what I was seeing, and if I had been wrong in the same direction twice, the cost could have been catastrophic. And if I was wrong the other way this time, if what actually happened in that room was nothing more than fear moving from one exhausted body to the next, then I evacuated a dying woman's final moments into chaos and protective suits for a threat that may never have existed outside of our own frightened nervous systems. I have not been able to fully forgive myself for either possibility, and I do not think I will ever get the clarity that would let me choose which one to carry. I still work in that emergency department. I still tell every new nurse the same thing I have told them for years, that a reported symptom deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. And I have not changed that guidance, because I still believe, even now, that dismissing Denise's pain that day was the single worst professional decision I have ever made. But I no longer tell new staff that taking a symptom seriously will give them a clean answer at the end of it. I tell them, instead, that some nights in this work end exactly the way that one did, with every correct action taken, every protocol followed, and still no way to ever know, with any real certainty, what actually moved through that room, or whether it came from a source outside any of us at all. I have made my peace, as much as I am able to, with the idea that some nights simply do not resolve, and that the work, most of the time, is learning to keep showing up for the next one anyway. There is a stone in Germany, nearly 2 centuries old, that reads, translated plainly, "Here lies a riddle of his time, his birth unknown, his death mysterious." I have that phrase written on a card above my desk, not as decoration, but as a warning. I did not always understand what it was warning me against. I think I finally do now. Good evening. I want to tell you about a boy who died nearly 2 centuries ago, before I tell you about the patient sitting in my office right now, because the boy is the reason I chose this work, and the patient is the reason I have started to doubt whether I ever understood the lesson his story was supposed to teach me. In May of 1828, a teenage boy appeared in the streets of Nuremberg, Germany, barely able to stand upright, carrying 2 letters he could not explain and speaking only a handful of words. A shoemaker found him first, struggling to walk in a way that suggested either illness or a body simply unused to the demands of ordinary movement, and led him toward the authorities, who had no framework at all for what they were looking at. He gave his name, eventually as Kaspar Hauser, writing it himself in firm, practiced handwriting that stood in strange contrast to how little else he seemed able to communicate, and told those who took him in that he had spent his entire remembered life alone in a small, dark cell, given only bread and water, taught nothing beyond a few prayers he did not understand, and shown no human face until the day, near the very end of his confinement, that someone taught him to walk and speak just enough to be released into the world. He did not know how to react to the taste of meat, reportedly becoming ill after his first exposure to it. He did not understand his own reflection in a mirror, and was documented reaching behind it, searching for the person he believed must be standing there. The soles of his feet were said to be as soft as an infant's, unmarked by the years of walking an ordinary childhood would have required, a detail that struck the physicians who examined him as either the most convincing evidence of his account, or, later, the most damning argument against it, depending on which decade of the controversy you consulted. For a time, an entire city believed him, cared for him, championed his case as a genuine and tragic mystery, deserving of protection and study. A prominent criminologist took him into his own household, tutored him personally, documented his slow, remarkable progress in language and reasoning. with the meticulous attention of a man who believed he had found one of the great human puzzles of his age. And then, gradually, over the 5 years that followed, belief curdled into doubt. Inconsistencies accumulated, small at first, then larger, details that shifted slightly between tellings. A story that seemed, to increasingly skeptical observers, too neatly assembled for a mind that had supposedly developed in total isolation. Prominent supporters who had once staked their own reputations on his story turned publicly against him, calling him a fraud, a manipulator, a clever performer who had invented an entire childhood of suffering to secure sympathy and status he had not earned. One of his own former champions, a man who had once defended him fiercely, eventually wrote that Hauser was nothing more than a scheming, worthless creature who deserved to be put to death. A reversal so complete it is difficult, even now, to read without a particular kind of chill. He died in December of 1833 from a stab wound to the chest under circumstances that have never been resolved, murdered by an unidentified attacker, who left behind a note written in mirror script, promising to reveal his own identity and never doing so, or, as his critics insisted even then, wounded by his own hand in a staged attack that went further than he intended. Nearly 2 centuries of investigation, including DNA testing, conducted as recently as this decade, have never definitively answered the 2 questions that have haunted his case since the beginning. Who was he, and was anyone ever right to believe him? I have built my career around a very particular answer to that second question, one I chose deliberately, early in my training, as a kind of correction to the way Kaspar Hauser's own story ended. I still remember the first time I encountered his case, in a graduate seminar on the psychology of extreme deprivation, and the specific righteous anger I felt learning how completely his community had turned on him in the final years of his life, as though his suffering had needed to be perfectly, unimpeachably documented in order to deserve protection. I am a clinical psychologist specializing in survivors of extreme isolation and captivity, and the foundational principle of my entire practice is this: a survivor's own account of what happened to them deserves belief, even when the details cannot be externally verified, even when memory under extreme trauma is imperfect, inconsistent, sometimes genuinely confused about sequence or detail, because the alternative, the reflexive skepticism that eventually consumed Kaspar Hauser and left him unprotected in the final months of his life, causes its own distinct and lasting harm. I have taught that principle to residents, to caseworkers, to the family members of survivors who arrive in my office, desperate for a framework to hold what they are hearing. I have believed it completely for the entire span of my career. I want to tell you about the patient who taught me exactly how much that belief can cost, before I tell you about the one currently testing it again. 6 years ago, I began treating a young woman who had been found, at 19, after what she described as years of confinement within her own extended family's property, isolated in circumstances she recounted slowly over many months, in fragments that gradually assembled into a coherent and deeply disturbing account, naming a specific relative as her primary captor. I remember our early sessions clearly, the careful, halting way she offered details, often circling back to correct or refine something she had said weeks earlier. A pattern I recognized from years of training. as entirely consistent with how trauma memory actually functions rather than any evidence of fabrication. I believed her completely, and I want to be honest that my belief was not naive. I have spent my career learning how trauma fragments memory, how survivors of prolonged isolation often cannot produce a clean, linear account precisely because their captivity denied them the ordinary developmental tools most people use to organize memory into narrative in the first place. Her account had exactly the kind of imperfect, nonlinear texture that, in my professional experience, tends to indicate genuine trauma rather than fabrication. I advocated for her fully, in family court, in coordination with protective services, staking my own professional credibility on the position that her account deserved to be acted upon rather than doubted into inaction. I remember sitting in that courtroom, watching her testify in a voice barely above a whisper, feeling a fierce, protective certainty that I was finally doing the thing Kaspar Hauser's own supporters had failed to do, standing firm in belief exactly when it mattered most. The relative she named was removed from the family, prosecuted, and ultimately convicted, largely on the strength of her testimony and my supporting assessment. I remember feeling, in the weeks after that conviction, a kind of settled relief I had not expected, the sense of a case finally, properly resolved in the direction I believed justice required. 18 months later, new evidence emerged, a set of dated photographs and corroborated employment records, placing that same relative reliably out of the country for a significant portion of the period during which she described her confinement. I remember the specific sick drop in my stomach reading through that evidence file for the first time, watching an entire structure of professional certainty I had built with real care come apart within the space of a single afternoon. The conviction was overturned. I do not know, even now, and will likely never fully know, whether my patient had confused this relative with someone else entirely in her fragmented recollection, whether some other, more complicated truth sat underneath an account that was genuine in its suffering, but mistaken in its specific accusation, or whether some other explanation exists that I have simply never been given access to. What I know is that a man spent 18 months in prison based, in significant part, on my professional conviction that belief in this particular case was the correct and necessary choice. What I know is that my patient, upon learning of the overturned conviction, stopped returning my calls, and that I have not spoken with her since, though I still think of her regularly, wondering where she is, whether she is safe, whether whatever she actually survived, in whatever form it truly took, has ever been given the chance to be properly understood by anyone at all. I did not abandon my foundational principle after that case, and I want you to understand why, because it is the only way what happens next will make any sense to you. I still believe as completely as I ever did that reflexive doubt causes real and lasting harm to genuine survivors, that Kaspar Hauser's own story is proof enough of what happens when belief is withdrawn from someone who most needed it extended. I simply no longer believe that belief alone is sufficient, that conviction without external verification can ever be treated as a finished conclusion, rather than a starting position requiring more work than I once thought it did. I want to tell you about the patient sitting in my office now because his case has returned me to that same unresolved question with a force I did not expect to feel again this strongly. 4 months ago, I began treating a young man in his early 20s, found by authorities after what appeared to be an extended period of severe isolation within a rural property, roughly 2 hours from the city, malnourished, minimally verbal, exhibiting the same specific textbook markers of prolonged confinement I have spent my career learning to recognize, an unfamiliarity with ordinary sensory experience, a limited and oddly formal vocabulary apparently taught in isolated fragments rather than acquired through normal social development, a profound naivety about basic features of the world that most people absorb before they are old enough to remember absorbing them. I remember our first session together clearly, watching him touch the fabric of the chair he was sitting in with a slow, careful curiosity, as though testing whether it was safe to trust its solidity. A small gesture that struck me, immediately and uncomfortably, as something I had read about in historical accounts long before I ever expected to witness it directly. The similarities to the historical case that shaped my entire career were, from our very first session, difficult for me to hold at a comfortable professional distance. Over these 4 months, his account has developed slowly, the way these accounts almost always do, fragment by fragment, session by session, gradually assembling into a story involving years of confinement by a family member he describes only in careful, frightened generalities, unwilling or unable to provide a name I could act on, even if I wanted to. I have watched myself, over these 4 months, reaching for the same complete, generous belief I once extended so fully to my previous patient. And I have watched myself, in the same breath, unable to fully release the memory of exactly where that belief led the last time I offered it without reservation. I sat with him 3 weeks ago during a session that has stayed with me more than any other since we began working together. The late afternoon light was doing the particular thing it does in my office at that hour, slanting low through the blinds and catching the dust in the air between us, and he was speaking more freely than usual, something in the quality of that light seeming to loosen him slightly. He described, in more detail than he had offered before, the specific room he said he had been kept in, its dimensions, the particular quality of light that entered through a single small window, the specific pattern of water staining on one corner of the ceiling that he said he had spent years memorizing simply because it was the only thing available to look at. And as he spoke, I felt something move through me that I still do not have a clean name for. A cold, growing certainty that I recognized the room he was describing, not from anything in his file, but from a photograph I had seen years earlier during the previous case. A photograph entered as evidence and later ruled irrelevant once the conviction was overturned. I did not say anything to him about that recognition. I want to be honest that I am still not certain, even now, whether it was a genuine, meaningful connection between 2 entirely separate cases, or whether my own mind, primed by years of carrying one unresolved failure, had simply reached for a familiar shape to explain an unfamiliar fear. I went home that evening and sat for a long while at my own kitchen table, with a cup of tea gone fully cold in front of me, turning the description over and over, pulling up in my memory every detail I could recall of that old photograph, trying to determine whether I was witnessing a genuine, disturbing echo between two real cases, or whether I had simply become the kind of clinician who sees her own old wounds reflected in every new patient who walks through the door. I want to tell you what happened the following week, because it is the reason I am telling you any of this tonight. Rather than waiting for a resolution I am no longer certain is coming. My patient arrived for his session agitated in a way he had not been before, sitting rigidly at the very edge of the chair he usually curled into, his hands moving restlessly in his lap, describing, in halting, frightened language, a sensation of being watched, followed, specifically naming a car he said had been parked near his current residence for several days, running. Dark-colored. Engine sometimes running, sometimes not. Always gone by the time he worked up the courage to look directly at it. It was a detail eerily reminiscent of an early, unconfirmed detail from my previous patient's own account. A car she had once described watching from her window in the months before her disclosure fully surfaced. A detail I had noted at the time, and never fully resolved even after her case concluded. I felt my whole body go cold, and still in a way that had nothing to do with professional composure, and everything to do with a growing, wordless dread that these two cases, 6 years apart, unrelated by any fact I could actually verify, were somehow speaking to each other in a language I did not yet have the tools to translate. I remember reaching, in that moment, for the small, solvable worry my mind always offers up when the larger thing in front of it refuses to resolve, wondering whether I had remembered to move my own car from a metered spot outside the clinic before the meter expired. A thought entirely unrelated to anything actually happening in that room, and I let myself sit inside it for several seconds longer than I should have, before bringing my full attention back to the frightened young man in front of me. I did not act on that feeling. I want you to understand that this is the choice I am still sitting with, unresolved, as I tell you this story tonight. I did not call the authorities, did not name a suspect, did not repeat the mistake I once made by moving from a survivor's fragmented account directly into confident, external action without additional verification. I also did not dismiss him, did not retreat into the kind of protective skepticism that left Kaspar Hauser unguarded in the final months of his own short life. I simply sat with him, believed the fear in front of me without yet claiming to know its source, and told him, honestly, that I did not have an answer for him yet, only my full attention and my genuine concern. I do not know, as I tell you this, whether that was the correct choice. I do not know whether I am failing him the way I once failed to protect a wrongly accused man, by extending belief too readily to an account I cannot verify, or whether I am failing him the way an entire city once failed a boy in Nuremberg, by holding my own doubt too closely at exactly the moment he most needed someone to simply act. I have found myself in the weeks since rereading my own case notes late at night, searching for a pattern I can trust, a detail specific enough to finally tip the balance one direction or the other, and finding instead only the same accumulating weight of uncertainty that has followed me since the very first case that taught me how much belief can cost when it turns out to be misplaced. His case remains open on my desk, literally and otherwise, sessions ongoing, no resolution in sight, and some nights, driving home from the clinic in the dark, I find myself thinking less about either of my patients specifically, and more about that single carved sentence on a headstone in Germany. A riddle of his time, his birth unknown, his death mysterious, and wondering whether every person who does this work eventually inherits some version of that same unfinished sentence, carried forward, case after case, never quite resolving into the kind of certainty any of us actually went looking for when we chose it. I still believe fundamentally in the principle that shaped my entire career, that a survivor's account deserves to be taken seriously rather than reflexively doubted. I have simply stopped being able to promise anyone, including myself, that taking an account seriously will ever tell either of us, with any real certainty, what actually happened, or what is still happening. In the room, a frightened person is describing to me from memory alone. I keep that card above my desk still, the translated line from a headstone in a country I have never visited. And some mornings, arriving early before my first session of the day, I find myself standing in front of it for a moment longer than I mean to, reading it the way you might reread a diagnosis you already know by heart, searching it for some new angle of understanding it has never once, in all these years, offered me. I have spent my career telling people, gently and with real conviction, that the sound they hear when no one else can hear it is still worth taking seriously, even when it comes from inside their own body, rather than the world around them. I believed that completely until I drove into a town in New Mexico for a conference 3 months ago and heard, for the first time in my life, a low, steady hum that no instrument I have ever trusted has been able to confirm exists outside of me. Good evening. I want to tell you about a sound that has never been recorded before I tell you about the one I have started hearing myself, because the first one taught me everything I thought I knew about how to listen, and the second one is slowly teaching me how little of that I can actually trust. Since the early 1990s, a small percentage of residents in and around Taos, New Mexico, have reported a persistent, low-frequency hum, audible mostly indoors and mostly at night, that no one else in the same room can hear. The reports grew common enough and distressing enough that the United States Congress eventually commissioned a formal investigation, bringing together researchers from the University of New Mexico, Los Alamos National Laboratory, and Sandia National Laboratories, equipped with acoustic, seismic, and electromagnetic monitoring instruments, sensitive enough to detect vibrations far below the threshold of ordinary human hearing. Some of that equipment, according to accounts I have read since, was sensitive enough to register the footsteps of a technician walking across a room 2 floors away, a level of precision that makes the eventual outcome of that investigation all the more striking to me. They confirmed that a measurable percentage of the local population genuinely experienced the phenomenon, a frequency generally falling somewhere between 30 and 80 hertz, though no 2 hearers matched their perceived pitch exactly to one another, a detail I have always found more unsettling than the mystery itself. Some described it as closer to a distant engine idling, others as a pulsing hum with a rhythm of its own, slow and irregular, closer to breathing than to any mechanical sound. What their instruments never once found, in months of sustained monitoring, was any external signal in the actual environment that corresponded to what these people were hearing. The investigation closed, formally without an answer, and to this day, researchers around the world studying similar reports in other towns, a factory town in Indiana, a coastal city in England, still cannot agree on whether the source is environmental, mechanical, or, in some still poorly understood way, generated somewhere inside the hearers themselves. I have used the Taos case in my own clinical practice for years in a very particular and I now understand somewhat self-serving way. I am a clinical audiologist, and a significant portion of my work involves helping patients understand and manage tinnitus, a ringing, buzzing, or humming sound generated by the auditory system itself, rather than by anything in the external world. It is an experience many people find deeply destabilizing, precisely because it defies the ordinary logic of hearing, a sound with no external source, audible only to the person experiencing it, impossible for anyone else to verify. I tell patients about Taos because I want them to understand that the line between an internally generated sound and an externally unexplained one is often far blurrier than either science or their own intuition would like it to be, that even trained researchers with sophisticated equipment cannot always draw that line cleanly. I have used it as a story of reassurance, meant to tell patients that their experience is real and shared, and does not require an external cause to be worth taking seriously. I have said some version of that story to more patients than I could count, and I believed every single time that I was offering them comfort rather than a warning. I want to tell you about a patient I failed in a much more specific way, because it is the reason I no longer feel entirely comfortable with how easily that reassurance came to me. Several years into my practice, a woman in her 40s came to me describing a persistent low hum in her apartment, audible mainly at night, that no one else in her household could hear, not her husband, not her teenage son, not a friend who stayed over specifically to listen for it. She had already seen 2 other specialists before reaching my office, both of whom had run standard hearing tests, found nothing structurally wrong, and suggested, not unkindly, that stress and anxiety were the likely culprits. By the time she sat across from me, she was exhausted in the particular way people become exhausted when their own reported experience keeps being gently, professionally disbelieved. I remember the specific care she took describing it to me, choosing her words slowly, as though she had learned, through 2 previous appointments, that sounding too certain would only make her easier to dismiss. I ran my own battery of tests, found results broadly consistent with what the other specialists had found, and offered her the same explanation I have offered so many patients since, that this was very likely a form of tinnitus, that her nervous system was generating a sound her ears were not actually receiving from the world, and that this did not make her experience any less real or any less worth managing with the coping strategies I could offer her. I remember feeling at the time genuinely proud of how I delivered that explanation, warmer and more validating than the 2 dismissals she had already received elsewhere. And I want to admit now that some part of my pride was less about her well-being than about my own sense of being the more compassionate specialist in the room. She accepted that explanation, though I remember, even at the time, a flicker of something in her expression that I now recognize, in hindsight, as a person deciding it was no longer worth the effort to keep insisting on what she already knew to be true about her own senses. We worked together for several more months on coping strategies, sound masking devices, changes to her sleep environment, and I remember her thanking me warmly at our final appointment, genuinely grateful, as far as I could tell, for having finally been taken seriously in some form, even if the underlying sound itself had never actually stopped. She moved out of state roughly a year later, for reasons unrelated, as far as I knew, to any of this. It was nearly 4 years after that, when a former colleague, working in a different clinic in that same city, mentioned to me, entirely in passing, that a decommissioned transformer near that specific apartment complex had recently been found to be emitting a low-frequency vibration measurable well outside its housing, a fault that had likely been present undetected for years before it was finally identified and repaired. I do not know whether that transformer explains what my patient heard. I want to be honest that the timeline is imperfect. The location only approximate, the connection more suggestive than proven, but I have never been able to fully release the specific, quiet horror of realizing that I offered a woman a comforting, complete-sounding explanation for a sound in her own home, an explanation that let both of us stop looking, when there may have been, the entire time, a real and locatable cause, sitting in the walls around her, that a slightly more thorough investigation might have found. I want to tell you about the sound I have started hearing myself, because it is the reason that old, uncomfortable memory of hers has stopped feeling like someone else's story. 3 months ago, I traveled to Taos for a regional audiology conference, my first visit to the town, chosen for its setting rather than any awareness, at the time, of its particular reputation. I remember the drive-in clearly, the landscape opening up into that enormous, empty sky as the highway climbed toward town, mesa and sage stretching in every direction, a kind of visual silence that felt at the time simply beautiful rather than significant in any other way. I checked into a small adobe guest house on the edge of town my second evening there, a quiet, thick-walled building that the owner proudly described as over a century old, and it was on that first night, lying in an unfamiliar bed in a silence more complete than anything I ever experienced at home, that I first noticed it. A low, steady hum, seated somewhere just beneath the range of ordinary hearing, present enough that I could not ignore it, and faint enough that I spent the first several minutes assuming it was some mechanical sound from elsewhere in the building, a refrigerator, a heating system cycling on in another room. I got up and walked the length of that guest house in sock feet at close to midnight, checking every possible source I could think of, standing beside the refrigerator, the water heater, an old window unit air conditioner that was not even running, and found nothing anywhere in that building that matched what I was hearing. I stood in the dark hallway for a long moment afterward, professionally certain, in the specific practiced way I have reassured 100 patients, that this was very likely an early, isolated instance of tinnitus, perhaps triggered by the altitude, the dry air, the long drive, and I went back to bed repeating, silently, the same reassurance I have offered so many other people, that this did not have to mean anything frightening about my own body. The hum did not stop that first night, nor the second. On the second night, I tried sleeping with earplugs, then without them, then with a white noise app running quietly on my phone, cycling through every strategy I have ever recommended to a patient, and none of it fully masked the low, steady presence underneath everything else, a sound that seemed, if anything, easier to notice the harder I tried to cover it. By the third night, I had begun, almost against my own professional instincts, to research the town's history online, sitting up in bed with my laptop casting the only light in the room. And it was only then that I learned what Taos was already known for among people in my own field. A detail I am somewhat embarrassed to admit I had never once encountered in years of using the case study without fully investigating its origin. I sat on the edge of that unfamiliar bed, reading through summaries of the 1993 federal investigation, the frequency ranges, the failure of every sensitive instrument to detect an external match, and I felt something move through me that I still do not have adequate language for. A cold, specific vertigo at recognizing my own present experience described, in careful scientific language, by researchers who had never managed to resolve it either. I remember closing the laptop at some point well past midnight, the hum still present in the room around me, and lying very still in the dark, listening to it with a kind of clinical attention I usually reserve for patients rather than myself, trying to determine, methodically, whether it was rising or falling, constant or pulsing, and finding that the harder I concentrated, the less certain I became of any of it. I want to tell you about the fourth night, because it is the one that has stayed with me most clearly since. I woke sometime after 2 in the morning to find the hum louder than it had been on any previous night, steady and low, and for the first time, seeming to carry a faint, almost imperceptible pulse to it. A slow rise and fall I could only detect if I lay perfectly still and gave it my full attention. The room was cold in the specific way adobe buildings hold cold overnight, even after a warm day, and I remember pulling the blanket higher around my shoulders without ever taking my eyes off the dark ceiling above me, as though watching it closely enough might somehow help me hear more clearly. I remember lying there in the dark, with my own pulse audible in my ears, trying, with every piece of professional training I possess, to determine whether that pulse belonged to the sound itself or to my own body's response to listening for it so intently, and finding, for the first time in my career, that I could not reliably separate the two. I reached, in that moment, for the same small, solvable worry my mind always offers up when the larger thing in front of it refuses to resolve, wondering whether I had left my rental car's headlights on earlier that evening. A thought entirely unrelated to anything actually happening in that room, and I let myself sit inside that thought for several long minutes, rather than the larger, more frightening question underneath it. At some point, I noticed my own hand had come to rest flat against my sternum, pressed there the way you might press a hand against your chest to steady a racing heart, though I could not tell you when I had put it there or why, only that it had arrived on its own, ahead of any conscious decision to comfort myself. I did not sleep again that night. In the morning, at the conference itself, I mentioned the experience, carefully and somewhat clinically, to two colleagues over coffee, expecting, I think, some combination of professional curiosity and gentle reassurance. We were standing in a hotel conference room lined with vendor tables, and the particular fluorescent brightness of a working breakfast, and I remember feeling almost embarrassed bringing it up in that setting, as though the ordinary daylight bustle of the conference made the previous night's fear seem faintly ridiculous even to me. One of them told me, without any particular alarm, that she had heard of visitors to Taos reporting exactly this experience before. Occasionally, though rarely enough that it was treated more as local color than genuine research interest. Something she mentioned the way you might mention a quirky local legend rather than a real clinical concern. The other, a colleague I have known and trusted for over a decade, someone whose judgment I have relied on through some of the more difficult cases of my own career, told me plainly that she thought I was likely dealing with a stress-induced tinnitus episode brought on by travel, unfamiliar sleeping conditions, and altitude. The exact explanation I have given dozens of patients myself over the years, delivered back to me now with the same calm, reasonable confidence I recognized immediately as my own. I remember nodding along, taking notes almost reflexively the way I do in every professional conversation, and feeling, underneath that practiced attentiveness, a small, cold recognition of exactly how thin and rehearsed that explanation had always sounded, even in my own mouth to the patients I had once offered it to. I want to tell you that her explanation comforted me. It did, for a while, in the same way my own explanations have comforted so many patients over the years, complete enough on the surface to let the listening stop. The hum has not stopped, not entirely, in the 3 months since I returned home. It comes and goes on no schedule I have been able to identify, sometimes absent for a week or more, sometimes present for several consecutive nights. Always at that same low, difficult register, always most noticeable in the particular quiet of very early morning. I have taken to keeping a log of it, the way I once might have logged a patient's symptoms, noting the date, the approximate duration, any pattern I can identify in the weather or my own sleep the night before. And I have found, reviewing that log after 3 months, no consistent pattern at all, only a scattering of nights that refuse to cohere into any explanation I can trust. I have had my own hearing tested twice since returning, by colleagues I trust completely, and both examinations came back entirely unremarkable. No structural cause, nothing that would explain, in any way current audiology can measure, what I continue, intermittently, to hear. My husband, who has never once heard it himself, despite sleeping beside me through several episodes, has started, gently, to suggest I see someone about the anxiety he assumes must be underneath all of this. And I have not yet found a way to explain to him that the anxiety, if that is even the correct word for it, arrived only after the sound did, and not the other way around. I think often now about my former patient, the woman I once reassured with such complete professional confidence, and about the transformer that may or may not have been sitting in the walls around her the entire time, humming into an apartment she was told again and again existed only inside her own head. I have thought, more than once, about tracking her down, sending some form of overdue apology or explanation, and I have not yet done it, uncertain whether that gesture would actually serve her, or simply serve my own need to feel less alone in this particular kind of not knowing. I do not know whether what I am hearing now has an external source I have simply failed to locate, the way hers may have, or whether it is, as every instrument and every colleague I trust has told me, something my own nervous system is generating without any outside cause at all. I have come to understand, in a way I only ever understood as theory before this happened to me directly, that this distinction, external or internal, real in the world or real only in the body, may matter far less than I once believed it did, and that the actual, unresolved question underneath it, the one neither Taos nor my own life has managed to answer, is simply this: what do you owe a sound that will not stop, when no instrument you trust can tell you where it is actually coming from? I do not have a clean answer to that question, and I have started to suspect, watching my own careful log of sleepless nights accumulate with no pattern I can name, that a clean answer may simply not exist, for me or for anyone else who has ever stood in a dark room, straining to hear the edges of something that refuses to hold still long enough to be measured. I still see patients every week. I still tell them, honestly, that a sound only they can hear is still worth taking seriously, that their experience does not require external verification to be real, and worth managing with care. I believe that as completely as I ever have. I have simply stopped being able to promise anyone, including myself, that believing it will ever tell either of us where the sound begins. An entire kingdom once celebrated the death of a wolf, certain their terror was finally over, while the actual killing continued for months afterward. I have built my career on identifying predators accurately enough that a community can trust the relief I offer them. I did that once, publicly, with total confidence. I have never been sure, since, whether I was celebrating the same kind of premature ending. Good evening. I want to tell you about a kingdom that celebrated too soon, before I tell you about the county I am currently failing to reassure, because the first story taught me exactly what I am afraid of repeating, and I am no longer certain I have avoided it. I have found myself returning to this old foreign history more in the past month than in the 5 years since it first became personally relevant to my work, as though rereading it closely enough might finally hand me the one detail that lets me avoid its mistake a second time. Between 1764 and 1767, in the rural French province of Gévaudan, something killed as many as 100 people, overwhelmingly women and children tending livestock alone in open country, in attacks brutal and frequent enough to become one of the first true media sensations in European history, reported in newspapers from Boston to Brussels, translated and retold in enough languages that the story reached readers who had never once set foot anywhere near the Massif Central. Victims were found decapitated, disemboweled, their throats torn open in ways that struck contemporary observers as too methodical, too deliberate, for the ordinary predation patterns wolves were already known to exhibit throughout the region. The attacks spread across an area of hundreds of square miles, faster and more widely than any single animal should reasonably have been able to cover, a detail that fed both the period's supernatural theories and modern historian suspicion that more than one animal was likely responsible from the very beginning. In September of 1765, the king's own gun-bearer, a man in his 70s dispatched personally by Louis XV after lesser hunting parties had repeatedly failed, shot and killed a large wolf near an abbey, and the kingdom, exhausted by over a year of terror, declared the beast dead and the crisis over. The animal was stuffed, paraded, sent to the royal court as a trophy of resolution, its killer rewarded with money and titles. Bounties were paid. Celebrations followed across the province, church bells reportedly rung in relief in several villages. And within a few months, the attacks resumed, more aggressive than before, continuing for nearly 2 more years until a second, largely unrelated kill by a local hunter finally, quietly, ended them for good, with considerably less fanfare than the first false ending had received. Modern historians who have studied the case closely believe the first celebrated wolf, the one an entire kingdom rejoiced over, was very likely not the actual animal or animals responsible for most of the killing at all. An official body, under enormous public and political pressure to produce an ending, produced one, and the relief that followed was real and widely felt, and almost entirely premature. I have thought about that specific sequence more times than I can count in my own career, the relief arriving before the truth does, a community exhaling in gratitude for a resolution that was never actually earned. I am a wildlife predator conflict biologist, working primarily across ranch country in western Montana, spending most of my working days driving long gravel roads between properties, examining kill sites, reviewing trail camera footage, and sitting across kitchen tables from ranchers whose livelihoods depend, in part, on my ability to tell them accurately what is killing their animals and what, if anything, should be done about it. It is quieter, more solitary work than people expect when I describe it. Long stretches of field work, punctuated by short, high-pressure windows in which an entire community's fear condenses into a single meeting, a single conclusion, a single name. The central difficult tension of my job is this. When livestock or pets are killed by a predator, in a community already frightened and increasingly inclined toward taking matters into their own hands, my identification of the responsible animal does 2 things simultaneously. It provides the scientific basis for appropriate, targeted management, and it provides the public emotional relief a community needs to stop escalating toward indiscriminate, frightened violence against every coyote, wolf, or mountain lion in the county, guilty or not. Those 2 functions are not always as aligned as I once assumed they were. I want to tell you about the case that taught me how far apart they can actually be. 5 years ago, early in my current position, a series of livestock kills across a ranching community north of here escalated over several weeks into something close to genuine panic. Ranchers organizing their own night patrols, a local gun shop, reporting a sharp increase in ammunition sales, 2 separate incidents of ranchers shooting at coyotes that turned out, on later inspection, to pose no connection to the actual attacks at all. I remember the specific texture of that community's fear, distinct from ordinary agricultural frustration over predator losses, something closer to a held-breath vigilance that had started keeping people awake at night and setting neighbors against each other over property lines and grazing rights that had never previously been points of tension. I was brought in to identify the responsible predator and after reviewing kill patterns, tracks, and a set of trail camera images, I identified a specific, large male coyote with a distinctive gait as the most probable culprit, consistent with the physical evidence I had gathered and consistent, just as importantly, with the community's urgent need for an actionable answer, rather than an open-ended one. I remember reviewing that trail camera footage late into the night, the same handful of frames again and again, feeling a growing professional confidence that I now recognize, with the benefit of 5 years of hindsight, as at least partly a confidence born of exhaustion, and the sheer relief of finally having something concrete to offer a community that had been calling my office daily for over a week. That coyote was legally taken within the week. I remember standing at a community meeting afterward, watching the visible relief move through a room of exhausted, frightened ranchers, shoulders dropping, voices softening, several people thanking me personally, with a warmth I had rarely experienced in this work, before or since. One older rancher, a woman who had lost 3 lambs in a single week, took both of my hands in hers after the meeting and thanked me with tears in her eyes, telling me she could finally sleep again. I remember feeling, in that moment, genuinely proud of having ended something dangerous before it escalated further, carrying that particular warmth home with me for days afterward. The attacks resumed 6 weeks later. I remember the phone call that told me, a rancher's voice on the other end flat, with a specific, exhausted disbelief, describing a kill site nearly identical to the ones we had all already agreed were finished. I remember the specific sinking recognition of driving back out to that same community, reviewing a new kill site with almost identical characteristics to the ones I had already closed the book on, understanding, methodically and without room for denial, that the animal I had identified and the community had celebrated removing could not possibly have been responsible for what I was now looking at. The ground was still cold that morning, frost not yet burned off the grass, and I remember kneeling beside that kill site for a long time, going through the same evidentiary steps I always follow, and arriving this time at a conclusion I did not want to reach. I do not know to this day whether that first coyote had been guilty of some of the earlier attacks and simply had company I failed to identify, or whether I had been entirely wrong from the beginning, misled by evidence that fit a plausible story rather than the true one. I know only that a community's relief, and mine along with it, had been built on a conclusion that did not hold, and that by the time I understood this, the actual pattern of attacks had already continued for 6 additional weeks under the cover of a case everyone believed was closed. I did not correct the public record as forcefully as I should have. I want to be honest about that, because it matters for what follows. I quietly reopened the investigation, eventually identified a different, more consistent pattern, pointing toward a small family group of coyotes, rather than a single animal, and managed the situation through less publicized channels, trapping and relocating 2 animals over the following month, without ever holding another community meeting to formally walk back my earlier celebrated conclusion. I remember drafting an email to my supervisor at the time, explaining what I had found and suggesting we owed the community a fuller corrected account. And I remember deleting that email twice before finally sending a much shorter, vaguer version that mentioned only that the situation had been fully resolved without specifying how thoroughly my original conclusion had needed revising. I told myself at the time that reopening Old Panic would cause more harm than quietly correcting course, and I still do not know whether that was genuine professional judgment or simple cowardice dressed up in professional language. I think about that unsent, more honest email sometimes, still saved in an old drafts folder I have never deleted. A small, permanent record of the version of myself who knew. Even then, that quiet correction was not quite the same thing as honesty. I want to tell you about the case currently sitting open on my desk, because it has returned me to that same unresolved question with a force I did not expect to feel again this strongly. I have spent 5 years since telling myself that I would never again let a plausible answer stand in for a certain one, and yet here I am, 4 weeks into a case that is asking exactly the same question of me a second time, in a different county, with a different animal, and a different set of frightened faces waiting for the same kind of relief I once handed out too soon. 4 weeks ago, a new series of livestock and pet losses began in a different ranching community, roughly 40 miles from where that earlier case unfolded, escalating with a speed and intensity that has already produced the same familiar signs of a community edging toward its own version of panic, informal night patrols, organizing on social media. At least one reported incident of shots fired at an animal, later confirmed to be an unrelated, uninvolved bear. I have spent these 4 weeks doing exactly the kind of methodical, unhurried fieldwork I promised myself I would always do after my earlier case, driving out to each new kill site personally, photographing tracks and wound patterns before weather or scavengers could compromise them, cross-referencing every incident against known territories of the large predators documented in the area over the past several years. I have been asked, directly and repeatedly, by county officials and by the ranchers themselves, to identify the responsible predator publicly and quickly, and I have felt, every single day of these 4 weeks, the specific familiar pull toward producing the kind of confident, actionable answer that ended my earlier case so cleanly and so wrongly. A county commissioner called my supervisor twice last week alone, asking, not unreasonably, why an experienced biologist could not yet offer the community a clear answer after nearly a month of active investigation, a question I have not yet found a way to answer that does not sound, even to my own ears, like an excuse. The evidence I have gathered so far points, plausibly, toward a specific adult mountain lion with a known territory overlapping the affected properties. Consistent with several of the kill patterns I have documented, a female I have tracked through this same county for nearly 2 years without a single prior incident of livestock predation on her part. It is also, I want to be honest, not fully consistent with 2 of the more recent incidents, whose characteristics suggest either a different animal entirely or a second predator operating in the same area, a discrepancy I have not yet been able to resolve despite 3 additional weeks of fieldwork, wound patterns at those 2 more recent subtly but, to my trained eye, unmistakably different from every other incident in this cluster. I visited one of the affected ranches again yesterday, a small operation run by a widow named Colette Hargrove, who has lost 4 goats in the past 3 weeks alone, and I watched her walk her fence line with me in the late afternoon light, the mountains already going gold and then gray, as the sun dropped behind them, pointing out each site with a weary, practiced precision that told me she had walked this same route more times than either of us wanted to acknowledge. She asked me directly, standing at the edge of her property with the mountains rising dark behind her, whether I knew yet what was doing this to her animals, and I told her honestly that I had a strong suspicion, but not yet the certainty I wanted, before naming it publicly. She nodded slowly, in a way that seemed to accept my honesty, without fully forgiving the uncertainty underneath it, and told me only that she hoped I would not take too long, because she did not know how many more nights she could spend lying awake, listening for something she could not yet picture clearly enough to actually watch for. I have carried that conversation with me for the rest of this week, turning it over the way you turn over any exchange that asks something of you that you are not yet sure you can honestly provide. I sat in my truck 2 nights ago, outside the county extension office, a cup of coffee gone cold in the cup holder, staring at a community meeting notice, already scheduled for this coming Thursday, at which I am expected to provide exactly the kind of clear, confident identification I once provided 5 years ago. The parking lot was empty, except for my own headlights, reflecting off the darkened windows of the building in front of me, and I remember sitting there for a long while, after I had already turned the engine off, unwilling to go inside and unwilling to drive home, caught in the specific, suspended feeling of a decision I did not yet know how to make. I felt something move through me in that moment that I recognize now as the oldest and most specific fear of my entire career. Not fear of the mountain lion itself, but fear of the particular, seductive relief that will move through that meeting room the instant I offer a name. A fear that the relief itself, regardless of whether my identification proves accurate, will function exactly the way it did before, ending the community's vigilance, precisely when vigilance might still be needed most. I found myself reaching, sitting in that dark truck, for some small, solvable worry to hold instead of the larger one in front of me, wondering whether I had left the office thermostat running too high before I locked up for the night, a thought entirely unrelated to the community meeting looming ahead of me, and I let myself sit inside it for several minutes longer than the thought actually deserved, watching my own breath fog faintly against the cold windshield in the dark. I do not know, as I tell you this, what I am going to say on Thursday. I know the evidence I have is genuinely suggestive rather than conclusive. Exactly the kind of evidence that once led me to a plausible, popular, and ultimately incomplete answer. I know that a community waiting on my identification is not, in any meaningful sense, waiting patiently, and that every additional week I spend gathering more certain evidence is a week in which their own frightened, undirected vigilance continues to escalate in ways I cannot fully predict or control. I have drafted 3 different versions of what I might say Thursday night, saved in a notebook I keep specifically for this case. One that names the mountain lion outright, one that describes the evidence honestly as inconclusive, and asks for patience, and one, the version I am least proud of drafting at all, that offers the mountain lion's name, while quietly omitting the 2 inconsistent incidents entirely, a version that would almost certainly produce exactly the same relief I once watched move through that earlier meeting room. I know that the Beast of Gévaudan's first celebrated ending was almost certainly false, and that an entire kingdom's relief did not make it true, and that the actual killing did not care in the slightest how thoroughly everyone had already agreed to stop worrying about it. I have read, more times than I can count these past few weeks, the historians' accounts of church bells ringing across that province in celebration of a wolf that was very likely the wrong wolf, and I have thought, each time, about how completely certain that relief must have felt in the moment indistinguishable from the inside, from the relief of an ending that was actually true. I still believe fundamentally in the value of what I do. That accurate predator identification protects both livestock and the wildlife too often blamed indiscriminately in these communities' fear. I have simply stopped being able to trust the specific moment when relief arrives in a room full of frightened people, because I now understand, in a way I only understood as history before it happened to me directly, that relief and accuracy are not the same event, and that a community's willingness to believe an ending has very little bearing on whether that ending has actually arrived. I will stand in front of that meeting on Thursday, and I do not yet know whether I will offer them the plausible name they are waiting for, or whether I will tell them, honestly, that I am not yet certain, and ask them to keep watching a little longer than any of us want to. I do not know which choice serves them better. I have simply stopped believing, the way I once did without question, that I will always be able to tell the difference in time. I have spent my whole career telling people that their bodies are not betraying them, that whatever strange involuntary thing has taken hold of a hand or a leg or a shoulder is still, underneath it, entirely theirs. I believed that completely until 3 months ago, when my own left hand began moving in a rhythm I did not choose, and did not stop, and has still not fully stopped, even now, even as I tell you this. Good evening. I want to tell you about a case from 500 years ago before I tell you about my own hand, because I have spent 3 months now trying to decide whether the two are connected, and I still do not know the answer. In the summer of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Trophea began to dance in the street and did not stop. She danced through that first day and into the night, and by the following morning, several of her neighbors had joined her, drawn, according to the accounts left behind by contemporary physicians and city chroniclers, into the same compulsive, wordless motion. Within a month, by some contemporary accounts, as many as 400 people had joined her, dancing for days at a stretch, through exhaustion, through bleeding feet, through what physicians of the time described as a kind of trance none of them could interrupt. I have read the surviving records more times than I can count. The careful, bewildered notes of men trained to observe and diagnose, utterly unable to fit what they were watching into any framework they possessed. Several died from heart attack, from stroke, from simple physical collapse after days without real rest. The city's own physicians, believing the affliction to be a hot blood that needed releasing through movement, built a stage and hired musicians to keep the dancing going. A response that, if anything, only fed the crisis further, adding rhythm and encouragement to bodies that had already lost the ability to refuse either one. Nearly 500 years later, historians still argue over what caused it. Ergot poisoning, a form of collective psychogenic illness spreading through a population already starved and stressed past its limit, or some combination no single theory fully accounts for. What is not disputed is that hundreds of people, in full view of an entire city, lost the ability to stop their own bodies from moving, and that no explanation offered since has ever fully closed the case. I have used that story in my own clinical practice for years, though not the way you might expect. I am a movement disorder specialist, working out of a quiet clinic built specifically to feel unthreatening, soft carpet, muted lighting, consultation rooms designed to calm bodies that no longer feel entirely calm to the people living inside them. Much of my work involves helping patients understand a difficult, counterintuitive truth, that an involuntary tic, a tremor, a movement they cannot consciously control, is not evidence that something foreign has taken hold of their body. It is still their own nervous system, still fully theirs, simply operating through pathways that have, for reasons we can often explain and sometimes cannot, stopped answering to conscious will. I tell patients about Strasbourg because I want them to understand that this experience, however frightening, is an old and human one, documented across centuries, not a sign that they are broken, or possessed, or losing some essential part of themselves. I say it to calm them, watching their shoulders drop half an inch, the way shoulders do when a frightening thing is finally given a shared human history rather than a solitary, isolating one. I have said it, some version of it, probably 1,000 times in my career, and I have always believed every word of it completely. I want to tell you about a patient I failed to fully believe, because it is the reason I hesitated, 3 months ago, to take my own body seriously. Several years into my practice, I treated a young woman with what appeared to be a functional tremor in her right hand, intermittent, stress-responsive, worsening under observation in the specific pattern that so often points toward a psychological rather than a purely neurological cause. I remember her clearly, a college student, articulate and self-aware, able to describe her own symptoms with a precision that at the time I read as further evidence supporting my assessment rather than as anything more troubling. I was confident in that assessment. I explained it to her carefully, kindly, the same way I explain it to everyone, sketching out for her, on the small whiteboard in my office, the pathways I believed were responsible, and I recommended therapy rather than further neurological workup, believing I was giving her the most useful answer available. 8 months later, after her symptoms had continued to worsen despite the therapy, spreading gradually up into her forearm in a progression that should have concerned me more than it did at each follow-up visit, a colleague ordered additional imaging that I had not pursued and found a small, treatable lesion that had been sitting undiagnosed the entire time I had been reassuring her that her body was, fundamentally, still fully her own. I remember the specific sick drop in my stomach, reading that imaging report, recognizing every one of my own confident notes from the preceding 8 months now, sitting beside it, like a record of everything I had missed. She recovered, eventually, after treatment, though slower, and with more lasting difficulty than she likely would have had the diagnosis come sooner. She has never blamed me directly. I have never stopped wondering how much of her recovery I cost her by being confident instead of thorough. I want to tell you about my own hand now, because it is the reason I am telling you any of this at all. 3 months ago, I noticed a small rhythmic movement in the fingers of my left hand while reading in the evening, a light, repetitive tapping against my leg that I did not consciously initiate, and could not, in the moment, immediately stop. I was sitting in my usual chair, a mug of tea cooling on the side table beside me, the house quiet in the particular, settled way it gets after 9 in the evening, and I remember looking down at my own hand with a kind of detached curiosity before anything closer to alarm arrived, watching my fingers move in a pattern I had not asked them to perform. I want to be honest that my first response was almost entirely professional rather than personal. The same calm clinical curiosity I would bring to any new patient's description of a similar symptom. I told myself what I tell everyone. This is still my own nervous system. This is not something separate from me, taking hold of a part of me from outside. I did not think much more of it that night, finishing my tea, now fully cold, before I went to bed. Over the following weeks, the movement became more frequent, more difficult to interrupt, occasionally spreading briefly into my wrist, and on 2 occasions, up into my forearm, always in the same light, specific rhythm. 4 beats and a pause, 4 beats and a pause, a pattern so consistent that I eventually found myself unconsciously anticipating it, my whole body tensing slightly in the seconds before it began, the way you brace before a sneeze you can feel building. My husband noticed it before I fully admitted it to myself, catching my hand gently across the dinner table one evening and asking, with real concern in his voice, how long it had been doing that. I gave him the same answer I give my patients' families, careful and measured, a benign explanation delivered with enough professional confidence that he nodded and let the subject go, though I noticed him watching my hands more closely at dinner in the weeks that followed. I did not seek an evaluation right away. I want to sit honestly with you in the reason why, because it is the same reason, in a different shape, that once cost my patient 8 unnecessary months of uncertainty. I am a specialist in exactly this category of symptom. I know, better than almost anyone I could have gone to see, the full range of benign explanations for what I was experiencing: stress, fatigue, a mild and self-limiting functional tremor of the kind I reassure patients about every single week. I gave myself, in other words, the same confident professional explanation I have given 1,000 other people, and I believed it, for a while, exactly as completely as they usually do. I finally sought an evaluation from a trusted colleague 6 weeks in, after a night when the movement did not stop for nearly 40 minutes, longer and more insistent than anything before it, spreading for the first time faintly into my shoulder as well. I remember sitting in my own car in the clinic parking lot before that appointment, watching my own hand through the windshield in the strange muted daylight of an overcast morning, feeling, for the first time since this had started, something closer to the fear I recognize on my patients' faces every week, rather than the calm clinical distance I had been holding on to. My colleague ran every test I would have run myself: imaging, blood work, A full neurological exam conducted with the particular gentleness doctors reserve for treating one another, and found nothing. No lesion, no structural abnormality, nothing on any scan or blood work that would explain what my own hand had been doing for over a month. She told me, gently, essentially, what I have told 1,000 patients myself, that this appeared to be a functional movement disorder, likely stress-related, fully explainable within the framework I have built my entire career around. And I want to tell you that I believed her, and did not believe her, in exactly the same instant, for reasons I still cannot fully separate from each other. I remember thanking her, and driving home, and sitting in my own driveway for several minutes afterward before I could make myself go inside, watching my hand rest still and quiet in my lap, as though it, too, were waiting to see what I would decide to believe. I have thought, more than I am entirely comfortable admitting, about Strasbourg, about a woman who began to dance and could not stop, about 400 people whose bodies moved in ways that resisted every explanation offered to them for 500 years. I do not believe in any literal sense that whatever moved through Strasbourg in 1518 has moved into my own hand nearly 5 centuries later. I want to be careful and honest with you about that, because I think honesty is the only thing I actually have to offer at the end of a story I cannot yet finish. But I have started to understand, in a way I only ever understood intellectually before, exactly what it costs a person to be told, correctly and kindly, that their body is still entirely their own, while that same body continues doing something they did not choose and cannot fully stop. The movement in my hand has not gone away. It comes and goes now on its own schedule, sometimes absent for days, sometimes present for an entire evening, always in that same 4-beat rhythm I have never been able to consciously replicate or interrupt when I try. I still see patients every week, and I still tell them, in the same calm voice I have always used, that their bodies are not betraying them, that this is a known and documented and human experience, rather than evidence of something else. I believe that, as much as I have ever believed anything in this work. I have simply stopped being able to promise anyone, including myself, that believing it will make the movement stop. man once boarded a train that could not stop, that had nowhere to let him off between one station and the next, and when it arrived, he was simply not on it, and neither was a single one of his belongings. I have built my entire career around the principle that a properly run train cannot lose a passenger without a trace. I still believe that. I no longer believe it the way I used to. Good evening. I want to tell you about a train that could not stop before I tell you about the one I am still trying to understand, because the first one taught me what should have been possible, and the second one has spent 3 weeks quietly taking that certainty apart. I have never been especially superstitious about trains. I have ridden them my entire adult life, first as a passenger, and then, for over a decade now, as someone whose job depends on understanding exactly how much can and cannot happen inside their contained, well-lit cars without someone eventually noticing. I want you to understand that context, because everything that follows only makes sense against the backdrop of a person who has spent her career being, in this one narrow domain, professionally difficult to surprise, and who has only recently begun to understand how much comfort she had been quietly taking from that difficulty. In September of 1890, a French inventor named Louis Le Prince, a man now widely credited as the true creator of the motion picture camera, years ahead of Thomas Edison's more famous claim to that title, boarded an express train in Dijon bound for Paris. Seen off personally by his own brother on the platform, he was carrying with him the camera, the film reels, and the patents that would have secured his place in history at a public demonstration planned for New York only weeks later, an event that, had it taken place, might have rewritten the entire early history of cinema. The train had no scheduled stops along that route. When it arrived in Paris, Le Prince was not on it. Neither was a single piece of his luggage, gone as completely as the man himself. No conductor or fellow passenger ever reported seeing him at any point during that journey, despite an express train of that era carrying a limited enough number of passengers that a missing man in a first-class car should reasonably have been noticed by someone. French police and Scotland Yard both investigated, interviewing station staff, searching the rail line itself, pursuing theories ranging from robbery to suicide to, eventually, the persistent rumor that a business rival had arranged to have him removed from the race to claim credit for his invention. Neither his body nor any trace of his belongings was ever recovered, and the case remains, well over a century later, entirely unresolved. A man got on a train that could not let him off anywhere in between. He was simply not there when it arrived. I have thought about that case more times than I can reasonably explain in my line of work. I am a passenger rail safety investigator, working out of a small office lined with monitors and archived ticket logs, the kind of job most people do not know exists until something goes wrong enough to require it. The entire discipline of my job rests on a principle I have built my career around defending. A properly run train is a closed, accountable system. Every passenger who boards is recorded on a manifest, on a ticket scan, in a conductor's periodic head count, on security footage covering every car and every door. A person cannot simply vanish from inside that system without leaving some trace, somewhere, for someone trained carefully enough to find it. I have spent over a decade proving that principle correct, reconciling discrepancies, tracking down passengers who appeared to be missing and were, almost without exception, exactly where the paperwork should have told us to look, asleep in the wrong car, delayed at a connecting station, simply miscounted by a tired conductor at the end of a long shift. I have built, over those years, a quiet, genuine pride in being the person who can always eventually find the explanation. I want to tell you about the one time that principle failed someone, before I tell you about the case currently sitting open on my desk. 9 years ago, early in my career, a passenger manifest discrepancy came across my desk involving a late-night regional train. One additional ticket scanned at departure, then the conductor's final head count before arrival. I remember the specific, ordinary busyness of that week. A backlog of routine cases waiting on my desk. A supervisor who valued closed reports over lingering open questions. An environment that rewarded exactly the kind of efficient, confident resolution I had already begun to pride myself on. I ran the reconciliation the way I had been trained to. Checking connecting station logs, checking for a passenger who might have detrained early at an unscheduled stop during a signal delay, and I found what appeared to be a reasonable explanation. A ticket scanning error at departure. A double registration in a system that occasionally, under high volume, recorded a single scan twice. I closed the discrepancy as clerical, the correct and unremarkable conclusion in the overwhelming majority of similar cases I had already handled by that point in my career, and moved on to the next item in a stack that never seemed to shrink, thinking nothing more of it for 6 full weeks. 6 weeks later, a family filed a missing persons report for a man last known to have boarded that exact train, on that exact date, and never arrived at his destination or contacted anyone again. I remember the specific sick jolt of recognizing the ticket number in that report as one I had already reviewed and closed, sitting at my own desk with the old file pulled back up on my screen, reading my own 6-week-old notes, with a kind of horror I had never previously associated with my own handwriting. I do not know, to this day, whether earlier escalation on my part would have changed the outcome of that investigation in any meaningful way, and I have never been able to find anyone willing to give me a firm answer either direction, which is, I have come to understand, its own particular kind of unresolved weight to carry. I know only that I looked at a discrepancy involving an actual missing man and explained it away with the same confident, procedural language I have used successfully hundreds of times before and since, and that the 6 weeks between my closed report and his family's filing remain, in my own accounting of my career, an unresolved and uncomfortable gap I have never been able to fully close. I did not abandon my principle after that case. I want to be clear about that, because it matters for what follows. I still believe, as strongly as I ever have, that a well-run train is an accountable system, and that most discrepancies genuinely do resolve into ordinary, boring explanations, rather than anything more troubling. I simply changed the way I investigate every discrepancy since, treating each one, however routine it initially appears, with a thoroughness I did not always extend before that case, taught me what a shortcut can cost. I want to tell you about the case that has occupied my desk for the past 3 weeks, because it is the first one in 9 years that my thoroughness has not been able to resolve, and because it has forced me, more than any case before it, to sit inside a version of uncertainty I usually only extend to other people's unresolved fears rather than my own. 3 weeks ago, A routine reconciliation on a late evening regional service running through the Hudson Valley flagged a familiar kind of discrepancy. One additional ticket scanned at the origin station, then the conductor's head count confirmed before the train's arrival at its final stop. I approached it exactly the way my training since that earlier case now demands, treating it as a genuine open question, rather than an assumption waiting to be confirmed. I reviewed the security footage from every car myself, frame by frame, cross-referencing the timestamp of the ticket scan against the seating chart the conductor had logged during his rounds. Working late into the evening in my small office with the blinds already drawn against the dark outside, the footage showed a man boarding at the origin station, unremarkable in every visible way, seated in the third car, visible clearly enough to identify his coat, his bag, the specific seat he chose near the window, settling in with the particular, unhurried ease of someone who travels this route often enough to have a preferred spot. The footage showed that same car at every subsequent checkpoint along the route, with that seat conspicuously empty. No footage of him standing, walking to another car, or exiting at any of the train's 3 intermediate stops, all of which were captured on platform cameras that showed every door opening and closing, without a single passenger matching his description ever stepping off. I scrubbed back and forth across the exact minute the discrepancy must have occurred more times than I could count. Watching the same handful of seconds again and again, and found every single time the same seamless, unbroken absence of any transition at all. I felt something move through me the first time I watched that footage straight through, start to finish. A cold, specific unease that had nothing to do with any discrepancy I had handled before. A man sat down in a seat, in full view of a security camera, on a train with cameras covering every door and every platform along its route, and at some point between one frame and the next. Without any visible transition I could locate no matter how many times I reviewed it, he was simply gone, and the seat he had been sitting in showed no sign, in any later frame, that anyone had ever occupied it at all. I want to tell you about the conductor I interviewed the following day, because his account has stayed with me more than the footage itself. He was an experienced man, careful and precise in the specific way conductors who take pride in their head counts tend to be, someone who had worked that same route for over a decade, without a single serious incident on his record. We sat together in a small conference room at the depot, a cup of coffee going untouched between us, and he told me, without hesitation, that he had no memory whatsoever of a passenger matching that description, not boarding, not seated, not present at any point during his rounds through that car. He was not defensive about it, the way some employees become when questioned about a discrepancy on their watch. He simply seemed genuinely, quietly bewildered. I showed him the footage of the man he had apparently walked directly past at least twice during his checks, pausing on a clear frame of the conductor himself, standing less than 3 feet from the occupied seat, his gaze passing directly over it without pausing. He watched it in complete silence for a long moment, leaning closer to the screen, as though proximity might change what he was seeing, and then told me, in a voice quieter than anything else he had said in our interview, that watching it made him feel something he did not have adequate words for. A specific bodily wrongness he could not otherwise explain, as though his own memory and the recorded footage in front of him belonged to two entirely different nights. He asked me, before we ended the interview, whether I believed him. I told him honestly that I did, and I remember the specific relief that crossed his face at hearing that, followed almost immediately by an expression that told me relief was not actually going to be enough to let either of us stop thinking about it. I have spent the 3 weeks since attempting to reconcile a discrepancy that refuses, for the first time in my career, to resolve into any explanation my training has prepared me to offer. I have confirmed the man's identity through ticket purchase records, a real person with a real address, a small accounting firm 2 towns over, a wife who has called my office 4 times now asking, with a patience that seems to be thinning with each call, whether I have found anything at all. I have come to recognize the particular rhythm of her voice on the line before she even identifies herself, hopeful in a way that has grown quieter and more brittle with each call, as though she is bracing herself a little further in advance every time. During our second call, she asked me, directly, whether I believed something had happened to her husband on that train, or whether I thought he had simply left, chosen, for reasons of his own, to disappear from his own life, the way people occasionally do. I told her honestly that the footage did not support the second theory, that every indication I had reviewed suggested a man settling in for an ordinary commute rather than someone preparing to vanish deliberately. And I heard her exhale on the other end of the line, a sound that was not quite relief, because nothing about my answer actually resolved anything for her, only relief's more complicated cousin. The comfort of being told that her own instinct about her husband's character had not been wrong. I have found a real family filing a missing persons report 4 days after his disappearance, a report I have now spent 3 weeks quietly, and so far fruitlessly, trying to help resolve. I have reviewed every frame of platform footage from every stop along that route, more times than I can count, and I have found, each time, the same seamless, unexplainable absence, a man present in one frame and entirely, cleanly gone in the next, with no visible mechanism connecting the two. I sat at my own kitchen table 2 nights ago, with a cup of coffee gone fully cold beside my laptop, the paused footage frozen on my screen. That empty window seat lit in exactly the same fluorescent glow as every other seat around it, indistinguishable on its surface from 100 other ordinary seats I have reconciled without incident over the years. My own kitchen was quiet around me in the particular way a house goes quiet late at night when everyone else has already gone to bed. And I remember sitting very still, listening to the refrigerator cycle on somewhere behind me, grateful in a small and slightly embarrassing way for such an ordinary sound. I found myself reaching, the way I always do when a case refuses to resolve, for some small, solvable worry to hold, instead of the larger one in front of me, wondering whether I had remembered to submit my expense report before the end of the month, a thought entirely unrelated to the missing man on my screen, and I let myself sit inside that thought for several minutes before I could make myself look at the footage again. I do not know, as I tell you this, whether I am looking at a genuinely inexplicable event, or whether I am simply looking at the limits of my own investigative thoroughness, a gap in the footage or the logs that a more capable colleague might yet resolve into something ordinary. I have requested a second reviewer, a colleague whose judgment I trust completely, And I am still waiting as I tell you this, to hear whether her eyes find something in that footage mine have simply failed to catch after 3 weeks of looking too closely at the same handful of frames. I sent her the files 2 days ago with a note that I tried to keep clinical and professional, and I have caught myself checking my inbox more often than the situation strictly requires, half hoping for an answer that resolves everything, and half, I think, hoping she takes just as long as I have to find nothing at all, so that I will not have to sit with the specific, isolating possibility that the gap exists only in my own perception, rather than in the footage itself. I think often now about Louis Le Prince, about a train with nowhere to stop, and a man who was somehow, impossibly, not on it when it arrived, and about how easily an entire discipline, built on the principle that accountable systems cannot lose people, quietly absorbed his case as an anomaly, rather than a genuine threat to that principle's foundation. Historians and investigators have spent over a century offering theory after theory for his disappearance: rival sabotage, an unrelated robbery, a body pulled anonymously from a river. Each explanation plausible enough on its own, and none of them ever conclusively proven. The case simply filed away, eventually, as an old and famous unsolved oddity, rather than a live and troubling exception. I wonder whether every field that depends on closed, trustworthy systems eventually accumulates its own version of this case, tucked away, unresolved, cited occasionally as a curiosity, rather than acknowledged as the crack it actually represents in something we have all agreed, for the sake of doing our jobs at all, to treat as fundamentally sound. I still believe in the system I have spent my career defending. I still believe that a properly run train, in the overwhelming majority of cases, cannot lose a passenger without leaving a trace for someone thorough enough to find it. I have simply stopped being able to promise anyone, including myself, that this is true without exception, and I do not know what to do with a profession built entirely on a principle I can no longer claim to believe completely. I think about the conductor sometimes, going home each night to a wife who has no idea what he described to me in that small conference room, wondering whether he still walks his rounds through that same car with the same easy confidence he once had, or whether some small, permanent hesitation has settled into him the same way it has settled into me. The case remains open. The footage remains unexplained. And some nights now, riding home on that same regional line, after a long day spent trying to account for every passenger who has ever boarded it, I find myself watching the dark window across from my own seat a little too closely, waiting, without quite admitting to myself what I am waiting for, to see whether my own reflection stays exactly where it should. I have spent my career telling frightened owners the same simple, comforting rule. A dog does not lie to you. Whatever it is afraid of is real, even when you cannot see it yourself. I believed that completely until the morning I stood on a covered bridge in Vermont, watching my own dog stare at something above the railing that was not there, and understood for the first time that I did not actually know what I meant by real. Good evening. I want to tell you about a bridge in Scotland before I tell you about the one in my own town, because I have spent years using the first one to teach a lesson I am no longer sure I understand. Since the 1950s, a stone bridge outside a small Scottish village has developed a reputation among people in my field that most of us discuss carefully, if at all. Hundreds of dogs, many with no history of anxious or self-destructive behavior, have leapt from the same specific section of that bridge's railing, some fatally, some surviving only to return on a later visit and try again. I remember first reading about it in graduate school, in a footnote rather than a proper case study, the kind of detail researchers mention almost apologetically, because it resists every framework the field otherwise relies on. Investigators have offered theories over the decades: the scent of mink in the ravine below, an optical distortion in how the railing height reads to a dog's eyes, even among locals inclined toward it, something closer to a haunting. None of these explanations account for the full pattern. Mink live near other bridges that have never produced a single incident. The height and railing design are unremarkable by any measurable standard. Nearly 70 years later, professionals in my own field still cannot agree on what happens at that specific bridge that does not happen anywhere else. And the incidents, as far as anyone can determine, have never actually stopped. I have used that case in talks and continuing education seminars for most of my career, not to frighten anyone, but to illustrate a principle I have built my entire professional life around. A dog's fear response is not performance. It is not exaggeration, and it is not, in any meaningful sense, capable of lying to you the way a frightened or confused human sometimes can. When a dog reacts to something with genuine escalating alarm, that alarm is telling you, as reliably as any instrument I know of, that something in the animal's environment has registered as a real and present threat. I have built an entire career on the specific professional comfort of that reliability. The sense that here, at least in this one narrow domain, a living creature's fear could be trusted absolutely, without the layers of self-doubt and social performance that make human fear so much harder to read cleanly. I have taught that principle to shelter workers, to veterinarians, to police departments building canine units, and I have believed it completely for almost the whole of my career. I want to tell you about the one time that principle cost a family something I have never been able to fully account for. 9 years ago, I was retained as an expert consultant in a custody dispute, brought in to assess the family's dog, a mild-tempered retriever mix, whose behavior around the father had changed sharply over the preceding months, growling, backing away, refusing to be in a room alone with him, in ways that had not been true a year earlier. I remember my first session with that dog, clearly, a gentle, food-motivated animal who greeted me warmly and settled easily into every part of the assessment until the father entered the room, at which point his entire body language shifted within seconds, ears pinned, tail low, a low, steady growl that did not stop until the man had left again. I observed the dog myself over several sessions, varying the conditions each time to rule out coincidence, and the reaction was consistent, specific, and unmistakable to anyone trained to read it. I testified, honestly, and to the best of my professional judgment, that the dog's behavior was consistent with a real and specific fear response to that particular person, and that testimony played a meaningful role in the custody outcome that followed. 2 years later, I learned, through a colleague rather than through any formal channel, that the father had since been diagnosed with a progressive neurological condition that had, in its early and undiagnosed stages, altered his gait, his scent, and the subtle, involuntary movements of his hands and face in ways too slight for any person in the household to consciously notice, but entirely available to a dog's far more sensitive perception. I remember sitting with that information for a long time after my colleagues shared it, turning it over the way you might turn over a diagnosis of your own, trying to find the version of my original testimony that could still stand entirely unchallenged, and not quite managing to. I do not know, even now, and will likely never know, whether that retriever was responding to genuine mistreatment, to the earliest neurological symptoms of an illness no one yet understood, or to some combination the record will never fully untangle. I know only that I stood in front of a court and offered a single, confident interpretation of an animal's fear, and that interpretation reshaped a family's life in a direction I have never been able to feel entirely settled about since. I want to tell you about what has been happening at the covered bridge on the edge of my own town, because it is the reason that old, unresolved cases stopped feeling like a story from somewhere else. 3 months ago, a neighbor's dog, a calm, well-adjusted animal I had known for years, bolted without warning while crossing our covered bridge, and had to be physically restrained from going over a railing barely low enough to make that even possible. My neighbor called me that same evening, still shaken, describing the moment in the specific, halting way people describe things they are half afraid will sound foolish, said aloud, the dog going suddenly rigid mid-stride, ears pinned flat before lunging toward the railing with a strength she had never once seen from him in 6 years of ownership. The owner described the same specific behavior reported at that bridge in Scotland, the dog fixating on a point above the railing, growing rigid, then lunging, with no identifiable trigger anyone present could name. I assumed at the time an isolated incident, a scent, a sound at a frequency none of the humans present could register, something explainable within the ordinary range of my professional experience, and I told her exactly that, in the same calm, reassuring voice I have used on frightened owners for most of my career. In the following weeks, 3 more dogs did the same thing, in the same narrow stretch of that same bridge, none of them known to each other, none sharing an owner or a walking route beyond that single overlapping point of geography. I began keeping a small private log of each incident, the way I would for any professional case, time of day, weather, the specific point along the bridge where the reaction began, and I want to admit that some part of me was, even then, still reaching for the comfortable structure of a case study, rather than admitting how close to home this particular pattern had actually settled. I began visiting the bridge myself, at different times of day, bringing my own dog, a steady, unflappable animal I have trusted through 15 years of far more objectively frightening situations than an empty covered bridge in broad daylight, thunderstorms, emergency room visits, a house fire 2 towns over that we responded to together as part of a disaster response team. He has never, in all those years, given me a single reason to doubt what his body was telling me. On my 4th visit, close to dusk, my own dog stopped walking roughly at the same point every other reported incident had occurred. Ears back, body rigid in the specific, unmistakable posture. I have spent my entire career teaching other people to recognize as genuine fear rather than performance. The light inside the covered bridge had already gone dim and gray by that hour. The sound of the creek below strangely muffled beneath the old wooden structure. And I remember the specific, sudden silence that fell over both of us in that moment. No birds, no wind through the boards overhead, only the sound of my own breathing and his. I followed his line of sight toward the railing, toward the empty air just above it, and felt something move through me that I still do not have adequate language for. A cold, wordless certainty that whatever he was looking at was, by every professional standard I have ever trusted, real to him. I did not see anything. I want to be honest about that, plainly, because honesty is the only thing I actually have to offer you at the end of a story that does not resolve. I stood on that bridge in the fading light, with a dog I trust more than I trust almost any human alive, watching him stare unmoving, at a point in the air that held nothing I could perceive, and I understood for the first time in my career exactly how thin the line has always been between an instinct I have taught people to trust completely and an instinct that might, in specific and unpredictable circumstances, simply be wrong. I have not stopped bringing my dog across that bridge since, though I no longer let him near the railing, without a firm hand on his leash. I have not found an explanation, mundane or otherwise, that accounts for what happened to those 4 dogs, mine included, in that same narrow stretch of ordinary Vermont hardware and stone. I still teach the principle I have taught for years, that a dog's fear is honest, that it is telling you something true about the world, even when you cannot yet see what that something is. I still believe that. I have simply stopped being able to promise anyone, including myself, that knowing a fear is honest will ever tell you what, exactly, it is honest about.